Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the virtual breakfast. We have a lot of things to talk about this morning. We got Dr. Kim Cassida is going to talk about forages, and then Jeff's going to talk about our funny or interesting weather we're having. But before we start, just some housekeeping things we'd like to have you consider. Please mute yourself during the presentation so we don't have the background noise. We'd also like you to sign in with your first and last name. If you want to do that, click on the participant list at the bottom of the screen, find your name and hover over it. Click more, then rename yourself. Ask questions in the chat box. You'll find at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get them answered throughout or at the end of the program. RUP and CCA codes will be given at 7:30 if you're interested or need to get RUP or CCA credits. One thing that's really important that we'd like to share with you that MSU Extension programs are open to all. We'd like you to fill out the demographic information that Phil will put in the chat box. The demographic information data for our program participants is really important and a mandated aspect of all Michigan State University Extension programs. Of course, it's voluntary, and the information that you provide will be not used in any way to identify you, but rather a member of a group that participated in the program. A link will be in the chat, and we'd really appreciate it if you would fill that out. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kim Cassida, talk about late season alfalfa management. So I'm going to stop sharing, Kim, and let you go.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm just going to jump right into it this morning. And the first thing I want to talk about is just a little review on what fall dormancy is in alfalfa and why that still matters. Fall dormancy is a system that we use to rate released alfalfa varieties in terms of their basically speed of growth. When this system was first developed, it was tightly linked to winter survival, but they've managed to separate those two things. So now the fall dormancy is really more about how long the growing season is going to be for that alfalfa and how fast it grows back after a cutting. So the higher the fall dormancy number, and they are rated from 1 to 11, with 1 being very dormant and 11 being very non-dormant. The bigger numbers have a longer growing season here in Michigan. The regrowth is faster after each cutting. And as a result of that, your annual dry matter yield will often increase. Here in Michigan, we are recommending that fall dormancies of 3, 4, or 5 are your best bet. I think a few people try 6s, but you're getting into a situation there where they don't go dormant early enough for winter. And we have a few 2s still out there. The prominent example of that is our old friend Vernal. But you just don't, that's one of the reasons you don't see the yield with Vernal that you do with some of these more modern varieties. Now, if you're trying to look at winter survival, you should be assessing the winter survival rating or winter survival index. And this is a scoring system from 1 to 6, where 1 is extremely winter hardy and 6 is not winter hardy. This is the much more important number here in Michigan in terms of winter survival. And here in Michigan, you should be using a winter survival rating of either 1 or 2. Now, with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about what your alfalfa plants are doing in the fall. We see the growth rate will slow down, and that is due to the decrease in temperature and the length of the day. We also find, however, forage quality can be very, very high. And another plus is that it doesn't decline as rapidly with maturity as it does, say, first cut or earlier times of year. The plant is photosynthesizing and taking carbohydrates and translocating that to the crown. It's also moving nitrogen to the crown, and these things will be used to support its winter metabolism and survival. So it will still be there for you in the spring. In the fall, the plant is also forming its buds for that first spring growth. So it's actually very active and doing a lot of things that it needs its carbohydrates for. Growth rate in the fall is greatly related to the growing degree days. Temperature is very important. And research has shown that in order to fully replenish the roots after a fall cutting, you need to accumulate at least 500 growing degree days using the 41 degree alfalfa base to get those roots fully replenished after a cutting. At that point, your plants are probably only going to be about 8 to 10 inches tall because they just don't get as tall in the fall as they do other times of year. So how does that all relate to whether or not you should take that last cutting? We recommend that you should not cut your alfalfa if you will have less than 500 growing degree days between the harvest and the expected killing frost date. But there's a caveat here. If you have more than 200 growing degree days, I've lost my train of thought there. If you have more than 200 growing degree days, the plant has the ability to grow enough that it's dipping into its reserves. So you want to be between that 200 and 500 from your fall cutting to your very last cutting in the fall after a frost. And the reason for that is that when you have that less than 200 growing degree days, you can get up to 4 inches of regrowth, but it's not going to dip that much into your reserves that are being stored in the root. So you'll have a little bit of a hit on the plant's ability to survive the winter, but it won't be critical. It takes about 6 weeks to accumulate that 500 growing degree days in the fall. And that is the reason why we've had what we call no-cut windows in the fall that are based on not cutting 6 weeks before the first fall freeze. So obviously it's difficult to know when exactly you are going to be accumulating growing degree days that haven't happened yet. And so we know historically that typically it takes about 6 weeks to accumulate those. So we can make a guesstimate for you of when that first fall freeze is going to be based on historical data, and then move that back 6 weeks to give you a suggested date when you should stop cutting during that no-cut window. Now, whereas Michigan is surrounded by water, our temperature zones are quite variable because we have a great influence from the water along the shorelines. So it's difficult to just draw a line straight across the state and have a recommendation based on that. So you can look at this map here, get an idea where you are, and look and see when that window may start for you. So after you've had your last fall frost, you have the ability to take a cutting at that point or shortly before it, because you won't have been in that area of having more than 200 degree days before. You know, if you cut the day before the last frost, for example, you're not going to accumulate 200 growing degree days in that period. So should you take that last cutting, what does that do to your stand? It is safe to take a cutting at that point. If you do it, you want to leave a taller stubble for your plants, at least 6 inches. And the reason for that is that will help trap snow. The snow helps moderate the soil temperature, and this will help protect your crowns during the winter. So the photograph here is a stand that actually was not cut at all in the fall. So this is the new growth coming up the following spring, and you can see that we still have some of these long stems left over from last year sticking up there. But those were a good thing to have during the winter. You might consider skipping the fall cut if you're on an intensive 28-day schedule. When I say fall cut here, I'm referring to that after frost cutting. To just give your plants a break. And also keep in mind that a lot of people cut the alfalfa because they don't want to see all this dead material the following spring. It will pull down your forage quality a small amount. But once this stand is ready to cut, the amount of dead material that's mixed in with this is going to be minimal, because most of this is going to fall down on the ground, and it's never actually going to hurt your stand itself to skip that last cut. There is no problem whatsoever with leaving stubble, tall stubble, dead plants on the alfalfa over the winter. There are some trade-offs to consider of whether you're going to take that last cutting or not. This is a chart showing the distribution of yield in our forage alfalfa variety testing over a 5-year period. And you can see here that most of your yield is in your first cutting. And as you go up these bars, these are successive cuttings. In the thumb area and East Lansing, where you might get 5 cuttings, the proportion of yield in that last cut is much smaller than the proportion of yield in the first cut. And the same applies as you go farther north, even with fewer cuttings. And there's a couple of factors that are related to this, and that is when you have a very low yield in a cutting, your cost of taking that cutting off is going to be the same as if you have a lot of yield, and so you're going to have a higher cost per ton harvested just in machine and time to get that. You do have the potential that it has very high quality. It will reduce your yield for first cut next year in comparison to not taking a first cut, because basically anytime you take more cuttings off a stand of alfalfa, that is a negative for that first cut the next year. And we also know that young vigorous stands will tolerate post-frost cutting better than old stands do. Those plants are just more vigorous. I guess they've got more get up and go. The old ones may already be damaged and trying to quit. I just want to point out another thing that you should be doing in fall, and that is that this is an excellent time for soil fertility testing with alfalfa. And one of the reasons for that is that potassium is our most essential nutrient for cold tolerance and winter hardiness, and we need to make absolutely sure that our stands have enough potassium going into the winter. It doesn't do you any good to put it on in the spring if the plants are already dead because they couldn't tolerate the cold. Another plus is that lime, if needed, can react over the winter. It takes 6 months for it to do much to change your pH, and it can do that while the plants are basically dormant. Back to the potassium nutrition, I want to point this out, where a multi-year Purdue study found basically that the best yields were recorded with a fertilizer rate of about 50 pounds of phosphate and 200 pounds or more of potash. But the critical thing about this chart, this was a 5-year study with no P or K at all in the green, phosphorus only blue, P and K together blue. If you look when they got out to the 5th year of the study, yields are declining, but the sharpest yield happened when they applied phosphorus without potassium. That was actually worse than applying no fertilizer at all. And I've said this many times before in programs, and I'll say it again. When I look at soil tests from farmers that are having trouble with their alfalfa stands and looking for some advice, by far the biggest problem that I see is that your fields are low on potassium. So I can't underscore the importance of that nutrient enough. But you have to put phosphorus on also if that's needed. Base it on your soil test. And the last thing I want to mention is to consider whether your stand is at the end of its economic lifespan. Fall is a good time to evaluate this. And the easiest way to evaluate it is to look at the stem count in the field. This is pretty easy to do. You just go out with a 1-foot square and you can make that out of PVC, throw that out in the field in about 10 different spots and count the number of stems within the square that are longer than 2 inches. So a profitable stand has been shown to have more than 40 stems per square foot. And that should apply in any cutting. If you're below that threshold, now you know that perhaps you should be thinking about taking that stand out. And fall is an excellent time to do that because we know that alfalfa has autotoxicity, which prevents you from being able to replant into a recent alfalfa stand. But you can have that dissipating over the winter if you do a fall termination, especially if you also use tillage, which helps break down the autotoxicity faster. And I just want to point out that if you are going to kill in the fall, an effective chemical kill requires that you have at least 4 to 6 inches of actively growing alfalfa, and you need to have 3 to 4 days of plus 50 temperatures after the spray in order to make sure that your herbicide gets taken up adequately. Alfalfa is not the easiest crop to kill, so it's important to make sure that your herbicide has the best chance. And if you're going to plant a new stand, we're actually getting pretty close to the window for most states when this should be done. But new stands are similar to taking that fall cutting. It should be done at least 6 weeks before the first fall freeze. And the reason for that is as alfalfa seedlings develop, they actually have the crown above ground until about 6 weeks after planting, when they undergo something called contractile growth, which pulls the crown below the surface of the ground. And until that happens, the crown has no protection against frost. So if your killing frost happens while the crown is still above ground, it's likely to kill your seedling. And this is the reason why we have the recommendation of planting early with a late summer planting of alfalfa. Always pointing you to our website where you can find information about this and many other things related to. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Paul.
I'm going to now kind of circle back on some of the questions that were in the chat box for Kim's discussion. I'd also like to invite everyone, if you do have questions, put them in the chat box. And as we get along, if you'd like to just raise your hand or unmute yourself, you can ask it live. But Kim, one of the questions Phil had, does alfalfa use the same growing degree scale as corn?
Alfalfa does not use the same scale as corn. It will grow at cooler temperatures, and so it uses a 41 degree base, while corn uses a 50 degree base. So you would, and if you go into EnviroWeather, it's actually got a tool where you can calculate the alfalfa growing degree days. Of course, it's difficult to do that based on the future. You can't do that. You can calculate it based on the past. We haven't figured out the future part yet.
Well, that's for the weather forecasters to do that. So anyway, Clyde has a question. Does the same criteria for fertilization apply to clovers in the cutting schedules?
Or fertilization or?
Cutting schedule. I'm not
cutting
sure.
Schedule, sorry. Okay, yeah, cutting schedule. Actually, the question didn't really address whether it was cutting schedule or fertilization, but I would say that yes, comparable research has really not been done with clovers. It's just not as widespread a crop as alfalfa, but I generally use the same recommendation as I give people for alfalfa because we know that will work. It's possible that clovers might be a little bit more tolerant, but since we don't really know that, I just err on the side of caution and use the alfalfa recommendations for timing. Now, I will say one thing about bird's foot trefoil, which is not a clover, but it is a legume. It saves all of its root reserves are being put down in the fall. It does not do any storage earlier in the season. So it goes into that fall period extremely depleted. And so for that particular crop, for bird's foot trefoil, it's even more important than it is for alfalfa not to cut it when it's in that fall storage accumulation period.
Okay.
Kim,
I'm sorry.
Kim, I have a question for you in regards to some of these new varieties of alfalfa that are on the market. There's the Harv Extra. they have a very good rating for fall dormancy. What about the winter hardiness rating on these newer varieties? Do they fall into that 1 and 2 number that you talked about earlier?
Most all of the alfalfa varieties that are marketed in Michigan will have an acceptable winter survival rating below of 2 or less, but you can look that up. If you look, for example, in our variety test bulletin, we include that information for all the varieties that are tested. And NAFA, the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance, maintains that database. You can also look up varieties in their little bulletin that they put out every year.
Okay. There's another question. Clay has a question. Kim, is there a maximum height for alfalfa going into the winter before there will be harm for the alfalfa the following year? For example, mold, smothering, etc.?
No, whether or not you have mold happening is not really related to the height, to the amount of biomass you have out there. And alfalfa won't smother itself if you have a lot of mass, because basically what happens with alfalfa when it dies back after it's frozen, the leaves basically shatter and fall off and degrade very rapidly. So you're not typically seeing a lot of material laying on the surface of the ground, and just the stem material is not going to make enough biomass to cause smothering. So I meant what I said when I said there is no measurable downside to not cutting your alfalfa in the fall, really, no matter how tall it is.
Okay, Kim, thank you.
It will be just fine.
There's a kind of a question I'd like you to comment on, or so many times I'll hear farmers say, well, we have to leave that alfalfa at least one cutting go to flower in the season for the length of the stand. Would you comment on that?
That is actually an excellent recommendation. Alfalfa regenerates the root reserves after each cutting, but it takes it to 1/10 bloom before it has the root fully recharged. So if we're constantly cutting it at bud stage, it never quite gets filled back up. And over time, that becomes cumulative. So the idea behind letting it go all the way to flower at least once is to give it at least one shot at refilling the bank account back up to maximum. And that will get you ahead of the game on overall survival.
Okay, thank you, Kim. I have a question going back to the fertility and the phosphorus, the slide you put up. We're putting more and more manure on our alfalfas, and then that's putting a lot of phosphorus sometimes on those stands. How's that impacting that balance of potash and phosphorus? Or is that not an issue?
Well, that Purdue work was done, actually it was a much more complex experiment than the one slide that I put up, which was trying to summarize it. But basically it wasn't so much about the ratio as it was about the total amount. So where they had the worst performance was when they put on, let me get back to my slide here. Was when they put on a lot of phosphorus without any potassium at all. So they had.
I think we just lost Kim.
Shoot.
I think you're
Blinked
right,
out
Paul.
for a second.
Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me?
She's back.
Yeah,
I'm
you're back.
Okay, sorry. I'm not sure where I cut out there. I was just saying that the worst part of that was when they had a lot of phosphorus and no potassium at all. That's where they saw, basically they killed their plots doing that. So it's really critical that you keep your your potassium level up. And if you're doing soil testing, just put out potash to the recommended rate, and that will replace what you're using up. You won't see that severe potassium deficiency in those stands.
Kim,
I think.
Kim, don't you see a ratio between potassium and phosphorus that's closer to a 1-to-1 than it is to a 3-to-1 ratio that many times we would recommend that's in manure?
Well, you don't need to put on that much phosphorus. I'm not sure what your question is, Phil.
Well, what I'm saying is with manure, you still get some potassium, and it's about a 1-to-1 ratio. So is that enough in Paul's question to make
as
sure
long as
that
you're
you've
putting
got some?
the potash out to the rate that your soil test is telling you to put out, you should be fine. But that will probably put out too much phosphorus, and then you'll be into problems with nutrient regulations. It's one of the reasons why manure is excellent fertilizer, but it's not balanced for the needs of our crop. So you always have to look at the ratio of what it's putting out, make sure that you're meeting the minimum requirement of your crop when you hit that phosphorus cap. You may need to put out some chemical fertilizer to balance.
Kim, this is Bruce. I just have a quick question, given all the rainfall. What's the duration that alfalfa crowns can handle for being saturated under these, or, you know, I guess overly saturated, because we've got some 7 and 8 inch rains that have fallen. I don't know if there's anywhere for people to put water, but if there was, would it be a good idea?
If you have actively growing plants and the temperature is warm, alfalfa really doesn't stand being underwater for very long. Even a couple of days, you're going to see significant plant damage. If it has got some mass to it so that the stems can actually reach above the surface of the water, it will last a little bit longer. It can tolerate a much longer period of waterlogging when it's dormant in the winter. So you might think, well, it's, you know, wet for longer than this in the winter, but, you know, our criteria for our research trials is 24 hours. If we want to avoid having any yield depression from water, we're out there pumping water off within 24 hours. I know that's not practical on a farm scale, but if there is a way to get the water off quicker, that will certainly help you.
Okay, Kim, thank you. We've got a couple questions in the chat box. Leon asks, is there any special guidance for forage stands of grass in the fall?
Grass is a little bit more tolerant of timing than alfalfa is. But again, I think it's safe to use the same recommendations as alfalfa across the board. If you want to be conservative, that will certainly not hurt anything with your crops, and take it from there.
Okay, Bill has a question, comment. Your tables on 500 growing degree units accumulation use 28 degrees as the killing frost. Can we squeeze a couple more weeks if we use 24 or 26 degrees? I see alfalfa hanging on at 28.
Yep. Well, that is a good question. I had access to those maps that use 28 degrees, where we typically consider the killing frost for alfalfa to be 24 or 25 degrees. But I don't think it's going to make a great amount of difference as to the timing of when that happens. Jeff might be a better one to answer that question. Of course, the problem with a lot of this is that you're looking at it in the future. So you're always guessing, you know, how long is it going to be before this happens? And so it's a risk management issue of how often is this going to happen. That map that I showed was median date, which means that 50% of the time that 28 degree freeze is going to happen before that date, and 50% of the time it might happen after.
Paul,
and we don't know how long.
Paul, I would say that when Bill is asking about the growing degree days, if you have temperatures in the low 20s, when you look at the growing degree calculations, it's 41 degrees and above. So unless you're getting a lot of really warm temperatures following that, you're not going to really be adding many growing degree days on that alfalfa stand. So yeah, it's going to be minimal at most, between 28 to 24. Yeah, you know, that time of the year, you're just not going to get very many growing degree days.
Very much growth. Yeah, Phil just said what I said in a shorter way. Thank you, Phil.
Jeff,
I don't know.
you unmuted?
Jeff looks like
Yes,
he might want to chime in.
Yes, just in a follow-up on that, I agree completely. The statistics are the best thing that we have. But I would use that medium range, that 6 to 10 day and 8 to 14 day outlook. It has skill, and it's almost certainly going to push in the right direction if it's going to be warmer than normal or cooler than normal. And you can, especially as we get out to that edge of the season. But the reason last year we saw a great example of this. We had a period, a week and a half at the end of October and early November, and the temperatures were in the 80s. And I can't even imagine millions of dollars saved in energy costs for grain drying. But we would have easily gotten a huge chunk of degree days at the same time. It doesn't happen that often, and that's what the statistics, Kim, that you're talking about reflect. It's not a high probability event, but it would still be information that you could have used last year and would have won. I mean, if you would have followed it. But it's going out on the edge to try to push your decision to the last minute. But those medium forecasts can give you some idea if there might be some late accumulations, or not. If it's cold, obviously you're not going to get it.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions for Kim or Jeff from the forage or weather standpoint?
Paul, there was a question from Tony about the use of boron.
Oh, I'm
Kim.
sorry.
Alfalfa is a crop that requires boron. That can basically be put on at any time of year, but typically we put it on with our P and K because we're putting out such a small amount of boron, it needs to be mixed with something. And you can get fertilizers targeted for alfalfa that typically contain boron. So if we typically recommend on a heavy soil to put out 1 pound of boron sometime during the lifetime of the stand. And on a sandier soil, you may need to put it on a couple of times at up to 3 to 4 pounds per acre, because boron leaches out with water, so it doesn't hold well in a sandy soil.
Yeah, Kim, do we need to be concerned? At what point does that become a toxic level? I know boron at 1 pound is a pretty light load, but I know some of these guys try to put on 2 down here, and if you get double coverage or some of those areas can get more than they need. Is that an issue?
Well, alfalfa is pretty tolerant of boron, but still, you don't want to go over that 3 to 4 pound per acre every few years level, because you can run into problems where, well, it could get toxic to the alfalfa itself, but if you build up too much boron in your soil and then go into, say, a corn rotation, then you can have problems with the corn, because corn has a lower tolerance to boron than alfalfa does. But using the typical recommended levels are calibrated to avoid that problem. So that's why it's important to stick to the calibrated, the recommended levels. Too much is not better in this case, or more is not better.
Okay, thank you. Very, very good questions. Very good information, Kim, Jeff. Moving along, is there again, Marty's on, Chris is on, Dennis Pennington's on. Any of you have any comments that you'd like to share this morning?
Hey, Paul, I have a quick question for Marty,
Yeah.
which is, we talked about the rust. Marty, is there anything as we're looking through those fields that gives us a clue whether we got southern versus common rust?
Hey, Bruce. Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, I'm having a little bit of trouble myself differentiating the 2 different rusts. So getting them back to the lab and looking underneath the scope, looking at the spores is really helpful. So I've been told that common rust will typically protrude through the upper and lower side of the leaf, whereas southern rust will tend to be just on the upper side of the leaf. Southern rust pustules tend to be clustered together and not as scattered across the leaf, but I mean, that's not a great diagnostic if you're not so familiar with it. So yeah, so if you can too, just grab a sample and send it in. If you can't get a sample like of that or some other sort of disease in straight away, especially for corn, just let it dry. If you put it in the fridge for a day or two, then it's going to get pretty moldy and hard to figure out what's on there. So
Thank you.
I think get a good sense of where this problem is at across the state.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for any of the specialists? Seeing none and hearing none, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Certainly invite you for next week for Dr. Basso. I think that's it's something that I don't think you'll be disappointed by his presentation and the information that he's going to provide. So with that, thank you again, everyone, and have a good day and have a good rest of the week.